Okay, hello everyone. How are you doing? Thanks for coming to this year's summer camp 2023. We're happy to see new and, of course, familiar faces. So today in this seminar, we're going to be talking about why it's important to index your suspension bushings. Who here has suspension bushings on their Miata? That's right, they're important. Who here has poly suspension bushings? Okay, well, this seminar is not going to do much for you. You can just go to lunch early. Well, not really because lunch isn't served, but it doesn't pertain to poly suspension bushings because poly suspension bushings have very little resistance in the full travel of the suspension. Unlike rubber bushings, where once you tighten them down, they will increase tension in more of their travel. So, my name's Matt, this is Nick. We're part of the customer service department. So if you have questions abroad, not just only for suspension bits, you'll probably talk to our department. Let's see here. I made a joke, it went over okay. We have a rusty, crusty rear subframe off of an NA or NB. Nick's going to show us what happens if you have a ride height, if you didn't change, let's say you have stock suspension now, you purchased our Coney kit and it's at a lower ride height now and you didn't index your bushings. Nick's going to show us why this is a bad idea. So,
I'll take the mic over. Okay, that's probably a better idea. Okay, so when you lower the ride height, whether it's with our springs and a set of conies or just a set of lowering springs on stock shocks, what's going to happen if you don't loosen all of the rubber bushings on the control arms and up here as well, is if you leave them, they will stay kind of indexed down here, and even once the ride height, the spring is going to be shorter, so it won't move up and down, and the bushings are going to keep binding like this, which can cause an artificially high ride height. So it's really important whenever you're installing a kit that's going to lower, or if you're just adjusting the ride height of coilovers, for example, you're going to want to make sure you take all these bushings and make them loosen them up just a little bit so that you can articulate the suspension like this and make sure that they articulate fully so the bushings don't bind up and cause unusual ride height. And this can, if you don't fully loosen just one corner of the car, this can leave you with an artificially high ride height at just one corner. So you'll be measuring to double check against all of our measurements that we provide. You might find a half inch too high on one corner. It'll be sitting kind of cockeyed. So if you notice that after a suspension install or a ride height change, best bet is to put the car back up on a set of wheel ramps or use a floor jack to artificially jack up the control arm to the correct ride height, and at that point you'll want to re-tighten those bushings and re-index them to that ride height. So that is pretty important, as if you're still using the rubber bushings, if they bind too much, they can start to tear and then eventually fail. So if you're still running rubber bushings, this is a pretty important step, not just for getting the car to look the way that you want it to, it's also important for the longevity of the bushings too. So the proper way to do that is once you're get the wheel off, get the car up on jack stands, every single control arm bushing, so these two up here, this one down here below the spindle, and then the front and back. And this is going to be on the front and rear subframes too. We just have this subframe here for demonstration purposes, but you want to make sure all of those are nice and loose and they articulate, so that when you put the car up in the air, it's ready to have that kit installed. Once you have all of the new suspension parts installed, there's a couple methods to do this. There's one method is to put wheel ramps under the tires, under both the front and the rear of the car, so that the car is sitting with its full weight on its suspension, and that way it's nice and settled. The bushings are still loose. At that point, you can go back in and tighten all of those bushings again to re-index those bushings to that ride height. We do get calls from customers about this when they install one of our suspension kits. Ride height's unusual at one corner or sometimes all corners if they weren't fully loosened. We've even gotten calls from shops who don't understand the need for re-indexing suspension bushings. So if you're taking it to a shop that you don't have any experience with, this might be worth mentioning to them. We have heard from some places that don't do this. So it's definitely an important step. We do mention this in all of the instructions for our suspension kits. So it's definitely an important one not to skip. Once you've loosened and then retightened those bushings, it's also important to either roll the car forward and backward a few feet. 10 or 15 feet is usually good to make sure everything's settled before you retighten the bushings. You can also jounce the car at each corner just to try to settle the suspension as much as possible and make sure those bushings are correctly indexed each time. The wheel ramp method is maybe more convenient. One other way you can do it if you don't have a good set of wheel ramps or 4 different wheel ramps is make sure all the bushings are loose and use a jack underneath the spindle here and take measurements of how the car is sitting before, compare them to the measurements that we give you on our website for the particular suspension kit that you have, and then use the floor jack to articulate the suspension up to that same ride height, measuring from the center of the wheel hub to the fender lip directly above it. Once you've got that sitting at that measurement that you want, or if you have a different measurement in mind for each corner of the car, at that point, leave the floor jack holding up the suspension in that place and then tighten those bushings. And then again, once you're done doing this, it's important to either put the car back down on its tires and roll it back and forth, or jounce each corner of the car just to make sure everything's settled and everything's good to go. It's also important to remember that some suspension kits, springs, can settle a little bit over time. So it sometimes can be a good idea to set the ride height just a little bit higher than you want it to actually sit at, so that in case everything does settle, it's still going to wind up right around where you're trying to get the car to sit. I think that covers everything here. Any questions while I'm sitting here? Yes.
Yeah, I installed the Kony Flyin Miata kit.
Okay.
2 kit.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't do any indexing on the bushings, but as far as I can tell, the the height's all nice and good. I suspect it might be because the bushings are all, the original. I have an 04.
Okay.
So they're probably shot.
How many miles are on the car?
104,000.
Okay. So this gentleman's question was, he installed a set of our Kony shocks with our springs and did not notice any unusual ride height when he didn't perform the bushing indexing. That could mean that your original bushings, since he mentioned his car is at about 100,000 miles, especially on the NA and B cars at this point, the original rubber bushings have degraded over time. It's going to depend, how much degradation has occurred is going to depend on a lot of factors, whether the car was driven in salt, how dry the climate is. So the desert's going to be a little bit worse for that because it's going to dry that rubber out much faster. So if those bushings are starting to fail or tear, that could definitely allow them to flex a little bit more than a brand new rubber bushing might. I still think that you could benefit from just double checking that and making sure everything's okay there. You might even find that some of the bushings are starting to fall apart and might need replacement too. Yep.
I was considering that if I needed to go that route
Mm-hmm.
at some point, that I would go with polyurethane,
Mm-hmm.
just because they're better.
Yeah, so with the polyurethane bushings, a lot of the ones that we've tried in the past have proven to be noticeably stiffer than the stock rubber ones, just because by the nature of polyurethane versus a rubber bushing, the polyurethane is not going to give as much. So for a lot of street cars, we typically don't recommend them. For cars that spend a lot more time autocrossing or on a track, or if your tolerance for noise, vibration, and harshness is higher than the average person, it might not be too big of a deal for you. But the Super Pro bushings, the polyurethane Super Pro bushings that we offer, we found actually do a pretty good job of remaining relatively compliant while not requiring this re-indexing procedure. So they've proven to be a pretty good best of both worlds. They are still going to be stiffer than the rubber bushings. So you have to kind of take into account what you're going to do with the car and your own personal preference as to how the car is going to ride. Yes.
Those Super Pro bushings, do you need to re-lube them over time like most poly bushings?
Good question. So question is, do you need to re-lube the polyurethane bushings over time? Specifically with the Super Pros, we found they include an incredibly sticky grease that sticks in the bushing very well. And if you get a chance to look at the interior diameter of those bushings, you'll notice they have like a crosshatch and a groove pattern in there that does what we found a really excellent job of holding onto that grease for a long period of time. So I don't think we've put enough miles on a set to find the limit at which you do need to relube them. But so far, our experience has been that they really don't squeak at all, that we can tell. If you get 30, 40,000 miles on the car, my guess is they might eventually need some relubrication. But they've proven to be much longer lived than a lot of the other poly options that are out there.
But you use kind of the squeakiness as the indication it's time to relube?
That's a good indicator, yes. I saw another hand.
Back to the indexing. So if you take your measurement from the center of your hub to the wheel well, or the center of the hub even to the floor, in your stock car, and you change your suspension, if your ultimate goal on your new suspension is that you're lowering the car an inch, you need to calculate that inch when you're jacking it up to get your ride height before you tighten.
Yes, so his question is relating to taking the ride height measurement before jacking the individual corner of the car up to set that ride height by retightening the bushings. So if you have a ride height in mind, keep that ride height in mind, use the jack to articulate the suspension up to that measurement from the center of the wheel hub to the fender lip above it. And then once you've gotten it set at that measurement, at that point you can tighten the bushings down, since that's where you want the bushings to be indexed to, is that ride height. And then once you've gotten everything put back together and put the tires back on the car, that should then have those bushings indexed there, and it should sit right about where you're wanting it to sit.
So how much should you allow for settling? Quarter inch or?
So question is, how much additional ride height should you add to account for the settling? Each suspension kit's going to be a little different. We found that the Coney kits with our springs don't typically settle that much, if at all. Some experience is going to vary because there's going to be manufacturing tolerances in the springs. Typically, a quarter inch is a good idea to plan for. It's also a little easier to lower the ride height, especially on a coilover set, than trying to crank it up. So going a little higher and then lowering it back down can sometimes be a bit more convenient than trying to raise the ride height after the fact.
So it just occurred to me, so if you're corner weighting a car, as you are corner weighting, do you just leave all the bushings loose until you've got your weight right? So then, otherwise you'd have to re-index several times potentially as you're doing your corner weighting. So I'm just wondering about that process.
So I'm not quite as familiar with the corner weighting process. Is that something you have experience with? I'll let Matt take that question for me.
So should you leave your bushings loose when you corner weight your car, is the question. And yes, anytime you're adjusting your ride height, always leave your rubber suspension bushings loose until you get everything nice and happy, and then you'll tighten them down after that. So, good.
What's the typical life on a rubber bushing? Do you go by age, mileage, combination thereof?
The question is, what's the typical mileage of rubber bushings? This gentleman over here has confirmed it's 100,000 miles. And you should replace them. A lot of factors, like Nick mentioned, temperature, age, dry. So you usually can see them starting to fall apart, and that's a pretty good indicator. If you want to have the best performance, then I would say maybe 10 to 15 years if you haven't changed them out. 22 years is probably, you've got all the money you can get out of those bushings. So thank you, Mazda. Go ahead in the back.
Can you replace the bushings without having a tool to manage the springs in the car?
The question is, can you replace the suspension bushings without having to remove the spring assembly from the shock? The question, let's see here. The answer, if it's an assembly and yes, that is correct. You do not need special tools to replace the bushings. You can remove the shock assembly incomplete from the top hat to the lower bit, all in one, and then you can get to all of your upper and lower control bushings. I'll preface that this is not a really fun job. A vise is probably not going to get it done. We use a press and possibly a U-joint tool. It's the kind of the big C thing that has different diameters of tubing on it. And then some other bits and a hammer and maybe the torch, and then you take a break and you try it again. They're not fun, but I don't know if it's all the work you put into it or it's just the premium quality of product you're putting back into it, but you will like it when the project is completed.
Well, I need a complete auto shop.
Auto shops are your friend here. I think we charged out, when we did services, about 4 hours of labor to do this, and that might be a little tight. So, for a complete car, about 4 or 5 hours. Yeah, and we're used to nice Colorado stuff that doesn't have any rust. Let me get to you in a minute.
More like 2 days.
Question?
I don't get this idea with the jacking technique that you're gonna raise that height to a target point. Why wouldn't the jack raise the car so that it's holding all the weight and the spring is in its natural position based on how it's set up? Why would you be maybe adding a half an inch or taking away? Aren't you artificially tightening that down against where the spring wants to be?
So just a clarifier on using the jack technique on each corner to gain the proper ride height. So our springs are going to be at 12.5 inches in the front for an NA. You'll put those bits on, have all your suspension bushings loose, verify that you have 12.5 inches from measuring the center of the wheel hub up to the fender edge, like Nick mentioned. And then you can't get to those bushings to tighten them because my melon's pretty big. The tire's in the way. Miatas are kind of low to the ground if we haven't noticed that. So you'll jack it up, put it back on jack stands, remove the tire, and that's when you use the jack to mimic that same height. Once that's at 12.5 inches, you can easily access the bushings. So we are relying on the spring to tell us the ride height and where the bushing should be indexed. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I could just see a scenario of somebody said, well, I want to get another half inch lower on the car, so I'm going to raise it up, bind that thing down where the spring isn't supposed to be.
Correct, yeah.
You're
So,
trying to get to the spec that you specify.
yep. You can go too far by raising it up. We're not trying to suggest that indexing the suspension bushings outside of the ride height of the spring, you'll be able to get a different ride height. That's not the correct way to do it. Yeah.
So no bind milling the other way.
Correct. So they'll be buying the other way, and that's a good point. I had a customer or maybe a shop call in and said, "Hey, it's settling too much." So I asked them, "How did you do your procedure?" Like, "Hey, I loosened all the bushings." I was like, "That's great." And then how did you, jack it up? And he said, "Well, I jacked that corner up until the complete car of that side was off the jack stands." So that was artificially putting that too far up into the fender well, thus not a good procedure. Yeah. Yes, Leon.
So, if you loosen all the bolts on the suspension indexing, is there a possibility of changing the alignment? Because some of those are alignment bolts.
The question is, if you loosen all the suspension bushings, hey, some of those are alignment bolts. Good point. When you lower or change your ride height significantly, I'm going to say about a half an inch is when we suggest doing a bushing index. You're going to get an alignment anyway. So, yeah, alignment will be important. Yeah, whenever you drop the car, I believe it's going to be a toe out or toe in situation. So, yeah, alignment's a good idea after that. No other questions, I'll continue on. Nick went over pretty well with the Super Pro bushings. If you are a person that has a dual purpose car, you daily it and you track it and you do a track setup, so you have a different ride height. Poly bushings are going to be great for that. You don't have to monkey around like Nick said with indexing this all the time. Another good thing is going to be hub stands, which we have right down there. They're not for everybody. But it makes the procedure a lot easier. You take your wheels off, you put the hub stands on, and you can access all of these bushings very, very easily. and it's more accurate, especially with coilovers and stuff. Thanks, Nick. So NC, we were talking about specifically NA and MB bits here. NC and NDs are slightly different. The procedure is mostly the same, although the rear suspension on the NC and NDs are much more complex. So they have many more links back there. Some of them will have a ball and knuckle style, so like a ball joint. So with this, you don't have to loosen this up because it moves freely even when it's tightened down. On your NAs, and some bits on the back of your NC and NDs will have a bushing style with a nut and bolt through. And once you tighten this down, it's more, the center bit is fixed, so it's not going to pivot easily like the other style. So I believe there's at least 9 connecting points on the NC and NDs. Pay attention, you can miss one. They're easy to miss. If you have irregular ride height or another thing that indexing your bushings can cause is, or not indexing them properly would be poor driving habits, characteristics. If it feels unsettled on corner entry, corner exits, you know, I think Nick mentioned one corner's a little higher. So it's a visual, and you know, you also can feel these things, which is important. How do we do, Nick?
I think we did pretty good. Are there any other questions?
What about variable diameter? What's the word? Durometer?
Yep, you got it, drometer.
Yeah.
The question is, different drometers, is there really variable drometer?
Well, different durometer bushings used throughout the car.
Gotcha. So the question is, are there different drometers for the right rear compared to the left front? I have no idea. I think that's more of a, hey, if you have a race car, this is more important. I don't know the chemical makeup of the bushings, and even for poly or rubber, I'm trying to think of any rear bushings that could be used for the front, and that would answer our question, but they are very specific on at least front to rear. So I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer.
Well, I guess it's just like rubber versus the polyurethane. I mean, the polyurethane one's all just the same durometer, because I believe they had different durometer bushings on the Miata for, you know, ride quality purposes and all that.
The question is, are there different durometers for poly bushings? Through manufacturers, I believe so. And like you mentioned, they probably do have softer, more firm bushings for the front or rear. I just definitely don't know the specifics there. So,
By kit.
yeah, definitely by manufacturer and by kit.
For the ignorant, when you say durometer, what do you mean?
Oh, I'm sorry. Durometer is, boy, I'm not a theory guy. It's pretty much the stiffness
Yeah, stiffness or resistance test.
of a piece of rubber. Yeah. Yeah. So, if any of these concerns sound familiar, hey, go back through the points. Loosen your bushings, get your ride height right, tighten the bushings is pretty much what we stated.
And then get alignment.
Oh, yeah, and you probably need an alignment at the same time. So, any more questions before we sign off? Way in the back. Rubber bushings or poly? Customer has a 2008, 20,000 miles, has some squeaks in the back with stock components. We'll have to talk to our customer service department.
And links.
So 20,000 miles on a 2008 is very low miles, so it's been sitting for a long time. I wouldn't want to say that the rubber bushings are decayed enough, but
Time hasn't done them any favors.
true. Yeah, there's that time aspect. Can you bounce on the front or the rear of the car to kind of pinpoint it, or is it just all over the place? Lots of bad suggestions for the audience at home are coming up. I do. I do off-road racing, so if you let me borrow it, I'll get full suspension compression and droop for you. So, I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer for you there.
Yeah, maybe have someone jounce the car and have someone else listen underneath it.
I think doing the procedure here, maybe, man, it seems weird that they would be indexed improperly, but maybe someone did alignment, loosened the bolts, and it was at full droop, and now they're out of sync. So, and that is another reason, or an audible cue that they're indexed improperly, but I sure wouldn't expect that on a low mileage car like that, so. Yes, go ahead.
After installing polyurethane bushings, is it natural or normal for the car to be like a lot harsher going through expansion joints in the freeway and like little bumps? It just really kind of makes it uncomfortable.
So the question is, in general, do poly bushings make the car more rigid or harsh? And they certainly can. That's why we've always hesitated to use poly bushings on street cars or street focus cars until Super Pros came out. Do you have Super Pro or another brand? So he has Super Pros and he still has a concern of that.
They're still going to be harsh.
Yeah, expansion joints, the very quick, rigid, abrupt changes, you're going to notice that a lot. What generation, sorry?
It's the
NA93, lots of miles or low miles? It's used well. And do you have, I guess I'm kind of going into the weeds a little bit here, but other chassis stiffening will help reduce noise vibration harshness that you possibly increase with the bushing selection. So frame wheel braces for sure on really any NA and MB. The NA6s, the rear subframe is pretty wiggly. And pretty much just all of the chassis stiffening that you could throw at it is preferred. So there is a little bit of weight penalty, but we want those bits to move out here and not to transfer through the cabin. So, thanks. Go ahead.
So, given that the Super Pro bushings are a little bit harsher, do you think for a car that's maybe dual duty but more focused on street than track, that the Mazda Speed or IL Motorsport bushings or rubber bushings are a better way to go? They're stiffer than stock, but they're not as stiff as a putty.
The question is, my car is dual purpose but more focused on the street. Should I use poly or upgraded rubber? And we would always suggest either the IL Motorsports, which is 30 to 40% more stiff, or the Mazda comp ones, we would suggest. They are more expensive, but if you prefer a little bit more, less harshness like your neighbor is experiencing, it's the good way to go. Yeah. Would you like to take a couple questions?
Sure. I think I saw another hand somewhere. Did someone else have a question?
You just asked the same question.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Okay. Anything else? Yes.
So after you said after you index the bushings, that you should roll the car.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure what that actually accomplishes.
So it helps to, when you've put all fresh suspension in the car, it's going to help to get the car rolling back and forth just to make sure the springs are fully settled on their perches on the shocks, and just make sure everything's settled as much as it can be before you go back to retighten those bushings, just to give the car one more chance to kind of even its ride height out at each corner before the bushings have been tightened.
The tires are going to keep the car the suspension from floating out. So when you let it off the jack stands, it'll just stand up straight like a 4x4 until you move it back and forth, and then like Nick said,
It'll settle in just a little bit more. Mm-hmm. I think I saw one more hand.
No, I was just going to say what Mark said.
Okay, perfect. Yes.
Kind of a random question, but for an NA or an NB, are there other rubber bits that you should be replacing besides just a matter of
Yeah, so the question is, on an NA or an NB, are there other rubber bits that can degrade over time and may need to be replaced? And the answer is yes. The rear differential bushings are a good example of that. Once those start to degrade, you'll notice more driveline lash, especially at low speeds when you're kind of stop and go traffic, like 5 to 15 miles an hour. You'll kind of notice it kind of jerking or bucking back and forth a little bit while you're moving around. That can indicate that those rear differential bushings are a bit worn and may need to be replaced. They tend to degrade a little slower than the suspension bushings since they're not articulating anything like as much as a control arm does, for example. But time, conditions, salt on the roads, for example, those can all degrade those rubber bushings over time. And so replacing those with a factory set can really help. If any of you have had the issue where you misshift a gear, especially on the track, we found that putting new bushings back in that location can really help ensure that you're getting a crisp shift into the correct next gear. So we offer a couple options for that. We have the standard, I think we sell the standard stock Mazda rubber ones. We also carry a couple of slightly stiffer rubber options from Mazda competition. They're going to be noticeably stiffer than the stock bushings, and I think we have a poly insert that fills the void in the stock rubber bushing and is a good kind of balance between a factory replacement and a stiffer bushing back there for more of a motorsports oriented kind of feel for the car. If you go full poly bushings on those rear differential bushings, you're going to notice a lot more noise, vibration, and harshness coming through the shifter especially. It's going to transmit a lot of that vibration that the rubber bushings would typically absorb directly to the shifter lever. So you're going to notice a bit more buzziness and a bit more vibration coming through the shifter handle. It's going to be a bit more direct shifting, so if your car spends a lot of time on track, stiff differential bushings can be a good modification to make sure you're not missing those gears. But for a street car, we typically recommend staying with either the stock rubber, or if you're okay with a little bit more NVH, going with the poly inserts are probably the best bet. Those two are probably the best bet for a street car. Oh, and engine mounts. That's the other one to follow up with the other options that may need to be replaced over time. The factory rubber mounts on the NA and NBs are especially notorious for degrading very quickly and failing remarkably fast. 30 to 40,000 miles can sometimes be enough for a factory rubber engine mount to start to tear or not be rigid enough as it should be. And you'll notice the engine rocking a lot more side to side. You'll notice a lot more vibration in the chassis, and since the engine is all connected with the transmission as well, you may notice the shifter moving side to side a bit more as well. So keeping a good eye on your engine mounts is a good way to ensure that the driveline stays in alignment and you're not noticing extra NVH through the chassis. Oh, and bump stops on the shocks are also another wear item, similarly there. So as any of you who've replaced your NA or NB suspension may have noticed, those stock bump stops tend to degrade quickly, and sometimes they're just disintegrated completely when you go to install a new set. We offer a set of poly, what's the material? Some kind of a urethane foam that does a much better job of not disintegrating to the same extent that the factory ones do. And if those are gone completely from your stock suspension, that can be contributing to why your car may feel really harsh over bigger bumps or expansion joints, like the other gentleman mentioned. All right, I think that wraps up the questions here. Travis had an announcement for you to make that I am blanking on now. So we have a new catalog out. So if any of you have not had a chance to see our new 2023 parts catalog, we do have a stack inside. On the table. Oh, there they are. So we have plenty of these available. So if you'd like to take a look through our current catalog, we've got all of our current parts there, some of our new parts, and also a bunch of wonderful pictures taken of all of our shop cars from Travis. And they're free. They're also on the website. Yep, go for it.
One more announcement. If you haven't picked up your registration yet, please do that before noon. It's going to be all done at noon, so please get that done prior.
Your lunch ticket's in that.
Oh, because your lunch ticket's in that, so that's very important.
You said one more thing, I'm sorry.
Car show ends at 1, make sure to vote before 1.
Car show, so that's still going on, but that does end at 1. So get your votes in and all that business also. Thank you for attending. It's been great. Have a good day. We're out.